Hello, my name is Sarah Davis, and this week we are discussing neglect and physical abuse. And I picked an article that discusses neglect with physical abuse, and it's called The Least We Forget, Remembering the Consequences of Child Neglect. And I just wanted to ask you guys a question. Did you know that 2/3 of families that are in child protective services are actually due to neglect? Neglect in our society seems to be put on the back burner. And this article covers profound developmental defects that neglect can cause and related to other forms of abuse, such as physical abuse. So this article that I picked shares how a range of interventions and preventions are being proven to be affected with these types of cases that they reviewed. And in the beginning of the article, it discusses how some organizations, such as foster care workers and child protective workers, actually categorizes neglect as a lesser form of harm compared to the other types of abuse, which I found very interesting because neglect can cause death in the extreme cases. It's neglectful of the children, which brings me to my very first question for you guys for the week, which is what makes neglect in our society something that we put to the side? What makes us underestimate the seriousness of neglect in children? So we seem to be neglecting the neglected in this society today. So the article also discusses how neglect is perceived to be a byproduct of families living in poverty. And if you've read the chapters for this week, chapter 4 and chapter 5, it actually talks about how that's a common misconception, how neglect isn't actually, or how poverty isn't correlated with neglect. That's just something that we seem to put together, but that's not always the case. I liked how this article also went over several different studies on how how the effects of cognitive developmental problems. And it goes over how children who have been neglected have found there's a defect of children with cognitive performances, academic achievements, classroom behaviors, and social interactions. So there's several things that correlate with cognitive development that are directly related to neglect, and that's prevalent in our books that we discussed as well. And children who had been neglected were actually, from this study, it showed that children who were neglected showed the poorest school performance compared to physical abuse and sexual abuse. The article goes on to talk about several other cognitive development as well as psychological development, which I found very interesting and related back to the book as well. So when you read the article, try to compare and contrast the different things that you think might go with the book as well as the article. How I felt they meshed pretty well with some of the language that they talked about. The article then concludes with interventions and preventions, different methods of how we can prevent neglect and physical abuse in our children today. They talked about how we need to address the cause rather than the symptom of neglect, and we need to get to the root of this problem, which our book does discuss how we need to see the cause, but it can be difficult to actually get to a definitive cause of what's affecting the neglect. But some indicators that this article concluded was the family level. It consists of a single parent versus a dual parent home, and they found that 87% were more likely to be affected by neglect if they had a single parent in the home. They also realized other causes of neglect can be lack of social support, parental knowledge of the parents, parental parents lacking. So, like the knowledge that the parents have of how to parent their actual child. Boredom was even mentioned, and the lack of community resources. So something that if we can add community programs to support these parents, this will reduce the neglect of these children. And so adding those programs, those resources, parenting classes, just simple things that we can do in our society can support these parents and give them what they need. And so here are my last couple questions I have for you, and I'll also type them out so you are aware. So as educators, what are some signs of neglect and physical abuse will you look for in your professional settings that you might not have looked for before with reviewing this article and as well as Chapter 4 and Chapter 5? And then my final question for you is, what do you think would be harder to go through, neglect or physical abuse? And then what is your thinking behind which one would be harder? What was your thinking on that? Why do you feel physical abuse would be harder than neglect? I hope that this can give you some more information and that you enjoy the article that I chose. And that you enjoy your week. Thank you for watching this, and have a good rest of your week. Bye.